There are a variety of factors that can cause normal map seams. The most common place where it happens is along the edges where a model is mirrored. And this can be very difficult to fix sometimes, especially if you are viewing your model in an engine that interprets the tangents differently from the application that you used to produce the normal map. There are a few things that you can do to double check your model and just to make sure that these kinds of problems don't come up. First of all, make sure that you are using the whole model when you are baking. I know there are some people who will delete half of their low polygon model but while they're for baking, and this is pretty much guaranteed to give you a seam. If you look at the shading on the model closely, when I delete half of it, you can see that it changed. And that's because when you delete half of it, the normals are different on the low polygon model. So if you bake your normal map with that, then it will create a normal map that is expecting only half of the model. So when you go and add the other half back, then the normal map will be wrong. Make sure your vertices are actually merged on the center line. This is another one of those things that seems pretty obvious, but it can be something that slips through the cracks pretty easily. And you can see here, I have my model set to show border edges a little bit thicker. So it's an easy way for me to tell at a glance which vertices have not been merged yet. So you can see now if I go ahead and merge them, that line goes away. On a related note, I would also say that make sure that you don't leave this center line hard. I know that sometimes when you merge the vertices, it might not soften this for you, but unless there's a very specific reason for you to leave it hardened, I would go ahead and soften it for baking. If you are not mirroring your UVs, but the geometry is basically a mirror duplicate from one side to the other, then make sure that the UVs are merged. In this case, what's showing up here, this line, is not the border edge of the model, it's the UV border edge. And so you can see here, toggle texture borders. If I turn it off, this is the normal view. So it's kind of hard to tell which UVs have been welded and which ones have not. And if I turn it on, you can see this thicker line down the center. Basically all I did was I just moved both sides together and snapped them together, but I have not welded them yet. So in cases like this, I would go ahead and select all those edges and just say show UVs, and you can see that the line went away. So the thick line is only on the outside, which is what you want. And that's just another thing to do to make sure that your normal map renders predictably. On the other hand, if you are using mirrored UVs, then make sure that the mirrored half of the UVs are offset one whole number outside of the 0 to 1 space. So what that means is, normally when you build half the model and you UV it and then you mirror it over to the other side, what's going to happen is all the UVs are going to be on top of each other like this. And what you want is to make sure that it is exactly one whole unit over. And that's actually pretty easy to do. To quickly, I already went over this in volume 4 of UV layout, but to quickly reiterate, just make sure that you are in the Move tool. So press W, and then click on this button here. It'll change these fields to be relative instead of absolute, and then you can just type in 1 and enter, and it'll move this field being for X, this field being for Y. So it really doesn't matter where it is. Like, you could move it, this is 2 up, it could be anywhere, but it has to be a whole number. So as long as you're using not using any fractions or anything like that, then it should be fine. And this isn't just to solve normal map seam problems. If you are having problems baking and your normal map in general just looks bad, and this could be a big reason for that if you haven't done it, if you haven't done this already. Another thing that you can do is to make sure that the center lines of both your high and low res meshes are matching as closely as you can. Now, this is something that's easy to do in Maya because there's a grid that you can snap to very easily. But in ZBrush, it's a little bit more difficult because the grid kind of adapts itself to whatever mesh you're using. What you can do is, this is clearly offset, this the shape here, clearly offset from the center line. You can see if I have on mirroring in my brush stroke, you can see that it's mirrored way out over there when it should be more like this. So I've turned on the local symmetry for now, and it works fine there, but if I had it off, then you can see it's not working. So it's pretty clear that this thing is not in the center of the scene. So what you can do is you can press transform and then go to set pivot point, S pivot here, and what that looked like, it moved the scene to that flower shape, but in reality what happened was the flower shape moved to the center of the scene. Another thing you can do is to make sure that the model is actually perfectly symmetrical. Now, what can happen is, during the course of modeling, there's actually a lot of things that can happen where you might have actually accidentally nudged the model from the center line, and or in this case, what happened was I dynameshed it, and if you look at the polyframe here, you can see that this model actually doesn't have a center line. The way it dynameshed, there actually a row of quads going down the center instead of an actual dividing line. So you can see the difference that happens when I press this button here. If you go to under your geometry, if you go to geometry and then modify topology, there's a button here, mirror and weld, and if you press it, if you look closely at the model here, you can see that it changed a little bit. First of all, there's now a center line, but then you can see the geometry on the side changed as well. I'm just stepping back with undoing and redoing here. Whoops. So that's another thing you can double check, just to, if you're really paranoid and you really want to make sure that the geometry in the center here is as perfect as you can get it to be, just to help mitigate the normal map seam problems. If you still have problems with normal map seams, then what I would do is I would try to bake the same thing in another program. I bake most of my normals in Maya, but if I got better results as far as normal map seams goes from XNormal, then I would definitely not hesitate to use that instead. or the other way around, whatever the case may be. And, if push comes to shove, you can try to paint out the normal map seam as well, but that's usually a last resort. Normal map seams are actually a pretty rare occurrence for me, but I know it can be a very frustrating thing to deal with. If you've taken all the steps mentioned here, then hopefully that will help minimize the worst of the normal map seam problems.